As the movie opens, a white feather glides swiftly and steadily towards a neighborhood park. It sways in the wind until it lands on a man's shoe sitting on a bus stop bench. He stares and inspects it before putting it inside his diary in the little briefcase next to him. Soon, a woman comes and takes a seat next to him. She sits down and proceeds to read a book. He greets her and introduces himself before offering her chocolate. She cordially declines, but the man, whose name is Forrest, keeps on pestering her about it. He tells her about his mother always saying that life is like a box of chocolates as you never know what you're going to get. He continues to compliment her shoes, but the woman starts to get frustrated. He stares at her and keeps on talking about his life experiences. Eventually, the woman can't ignore him anymore, and she looks up as Forrest reminisces about his first pairs of shoes, which he claimed to be magical shoes that could take you anywhere. In a flashback, Forrest is at the hospital with leg braces. His doctor tells him to walk around. He does so as his mother watches him eagerly. The doctor tells her that he's going to be just fine now. He's given braces because he had a crooked back as a kid. Forrest continues on and adds that he was named after the man who started the Ku Klux Klan so that he can be reminded that people do stuff that makes no sense. In the flashback, young Forrest gets his brace stuck in a sewer grate as he and his mom walk to a restaurant. His mom helps him out and snaps at some men who keep gawking at Forrest and his dilemma. She tells Forrest never to let anyone say they're better than him and that he's just how God intended. He talks about how he and his mom lived in a big house that had been in his mom's family for generations. Since they had a big place with lots of spare rooms, his mom used to rent those out to earn money. That's how they maintained a good and happy life, with his mother always supporting and providing for him. Just as his mom tells him that he's no different from anyone else, Forrest's school principal tells her that he's different from the other kids and can't attend a regular school since his IQ is only 75. His mother tries her best to defend her son, but the principal explains to her that his brain capacity is way below average. The state requires a minimum IQ of 80. He asks her to admit him to a special school as normal schools cannot take him. His mother just sighs and says she'll do everything to get her son all the opportunities an average person gets. Forrest's mom doesn't want to give up on him. She's adamant about getting him into a public school, as she wants him to have the same education as anyone else. She claims that she's willing to do just about anything for it. That's when the principal then asks Mrs. Gump if she has a husband. She smugly replies that he's on vacation, as she knows what the principal is insinuating. That night, Forrest sits outside his house, while his mother has romantic moments with the principal in order to get Forrest into public school. He comes out all sweaty and tells Forrest to speak up. Instead, Forrest just screams and gasps and the principal runs out of there. At night, Forrest's mother reads to him, and Forrest asks her what vacation means since he thinks his father is there. She curtly answers that vacation means when someone goes away and never comes back. Forrest doesn't say much and goes to sleep. Despite the absence of his father, Forrest and his mother were never lonely due to the abundance of tenants always staying at their house. One of those times, Forrest's mother calls him for supper, but he doesn't come down. This concerns her and she goes to check on him only to find out that he's dancing with a tenant. His mother tells him not to bother the young man who seems to be a music enthusiast. But the young man seemed to like Forrest, and thought his dancing was pretty cool with the way his leg braces forced him to move around and swing his hips. This man was none other than Elvis Presley, whose inspiration to swing his hips around on stage was none other than Forrest. Forrest soon notices this and is excited to see Elvis on TV performing on stage. But Forrest's mom finds the dancing obscene and drags him away. Forrest is still speaking to the woman sitting beside him who's trying her best to ignore him, but Forrest doesn't care. He just continues on with his life story. Forrest's childhood is full of harsh moments like this, mostly because of his braces. In the flashback, Forrest has to take the bus to school for the first time. He doesn't get on right away as he's not supposed to take rides with strangers. He soon introduces himself and the bus driver introduces herself. He claims that they're not strangers anymore and gets on the bus, but once inside, the other kids don't let Forrest anywhere near them. They push him away from their seats. Until a girl named Jenny says he can sit beside her. Forrest just looks at her and is mesmerized by her sweet voice and beauty. She asks him what's wrong with his legs, but he says they're just fine. She tries again and Forrest explains his condition. She asks if he's stupid, but he takes it lightly. Jenny and Forrest introduce themselves and continue the bus ride together. The two crazy kids soon become inseparable. They do all kinds of fun stuff together and Jenny even teaches him how to read. He showed her how to climb trees and swing on them. They spend every passing second together. Soon, Forrest realizes that Jenny never wants to go home. He considers her his best and only friend. He claims that Jenny is really special to him. Forrest continues speaking to the woman beside him, as she tries her best to act as if she's listening. She just wants to read her book, but Forrest doesn't stop speaking. He remembers his past, and the time when some bullies pestered him by throwing rocks at Forrest. They called him all sorts of names and continue to throw rocks. Jenny tells him to run and he does so, but his braces slow him down. The bullies chase him with their bikes, and as the kids close in on him, Forrest picks up his pace. Eventually, he runs so fast that his braces break off his legs, and he runs way faster than the kids on their bikes. He runs like the winds blow. From that day on, Forrest would always run wherever he had to go. he runs through fields and roads, leaving all the spectators stunned at his speed. He continues running and reaches Jenny's home. Forrest reveals that Jenny's mother died when she was just 5, and her father was always grabbing and touching her. Turns out, he was an alcoholic man who abused his own daughters, but Forrest couldn't understand that. He just thinks Jenny's dad is really loving. One day, Jenny isn't on the bus for school. When Forrest goes to see her, she grabs his hands and pulls him into her father's field, while her father screams and chases after them. She runs breathlessly and asks Forrest to pray for her so that she can get away from her father. Her prayers are somewhat answered since the police take her away from her father, and she permanently moves in with her grandma, whose house is very close to Forrest's home. That's why Jenny always sneaks into his house when she is scared or when she wants to talk to him. Jenny and Forrest stay friends all through school. One day, some bullies throw rocks at him again, and just like in old times, Jenny asks him to run. Forrest does so and the bullies chase after him in their car. He runs faster and faster and eventually turns onto a football field. He zooms past the other players on the field. Everyone in the audience stares at Forrest dashing through the field in awe. He runs so fast that the coach recruits him for the team, and Forrest ends up getting into college on a football scholarship. He keeps on dozing off in the game, but as soon as someone tells him to run, he runs faster than anyone around and doesn't care. His team always wins because of this very reason. Forrest doesn't really understand the rules of the game and just runs for a touchdown. He keeps running right on through a marching band. Forrest recollects how he found college a confusing time in his life. He also remembers the day the US government first forced universities to admit black students. This created a lot of outrage since racism was very prominent. Forrest gets in the angry mob outside the University of Alabama. He asks one of the racist onlookers about the mass, and the racist just says that the government is trying to get black people into the university in a very disgusting manner. Forrest doesn't really understand racism, so he assumes the guy is talking about raccoons. And watches on as George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, makes his infamous speech against admitting black students into white schools. As 2 black students enter the university, Forrest notices that one of them has dropped a book, and he runs to give it back to her. He has no idea about the racism that's going on all around him. A few years later, Governor Wallace runs for president but is shot before the election. He doesn't die and Forrest recounts all the details, as the woman beside him gets on bus saying it's time for her to go. She's immediately down to chat and says that she can remember when Governor Wallace was shot. Forrest tells her that Jenny went to an all-girls college, but he'd make sure to visit her any chance he got. But one night, Forrest sees Jenny in a car with a guy. She's making out with the guy and says he's hurting her. Forrest doesn't understand what's going on and thinks the boy is trying to hurt her. He throws open the car door and starts beating up guy. Jenny stops him and tries to persuade the guy into staying, but he angrily drives away. Jenny is really mad at him but knows that Forrest doesn't know any better. She sneaks him into her dorm anyway to dry him off. Jenny says that she'd like to be a famous singer someday and truly speak to people through her music. They both strip to their underwear and as she's doing so, she notices him staring at her body. Jenny asks him if he's ever been with a girl. Forrest says he sat beside girls and doesn't understand what she means. Jenny soon takes off her bra. Forrest instantly looks away but she takes his hand and places it on her naked breast. Forrest cannot control his feelings and immediately ejaculates. He thinks he's done something horribly wrong and apologizes profusely but Jenny reassures him that it's okay. She hugs him and comforts him. She kisses him and her roommate is traumatized to hear all their conversation. Jenny doesn't really care about it and they sleep next to each other. Forrest eventually makes into the All-America football team because of his speed and gets his team to win every time. Because of this, he gets to meet John F. Kennedy. But all Forrest remembers about it is the free food and drinks that he was served. He drinks around 15 free Drive peppers and instantly feels like he has to pee. As he's shaking JFK's hand, he says the same and runs to the bathroom to relieve himself. Forrest recalls how JFK and his brother Bobby were both shot dead. After 5 years of playing football, Forrest gets a college degree. His mother is immensely proud of him. After the ceremony, a recruiter comes up to him and asks him to join the army. Forrest does exactly that. When he climbs on the bus taking him to basic training, he introduces him just like on his first day of school, but the driver just screams at him and insults him. Once again, no one wants to sit with him. Finally, a young black man named Bubba offers him a seat just like Jenny had done years ago. He asks Forrest if he's ever been on a real shrimping boat. Forrest declines and Bubba tells him about his life. Bubba also has a way of telling people about himself like Forrest. Bubba comes from a long line of mothers who have cooked shrimp for their racist white masters. Forrest learns about this and he and Bubba instantly click. The army general is incredibly impressed by Forrest since he does exactly what he's been told to do. The army turns out to be a great fit for Forrest, because he has an easy time following orders. He and Bubba become inseparable, even though their conversation mostly consists of Bubba telling him about every single shrimp recipe. As Bubba is speaking, Forrest finishes putting his weapon together, which he seems to be exceptionally good at. He constantly gets praised by the sergeant for his job. All this time, Bubba never stops talking about shrimp. He talks about shrimp all the time, even when they're cleaning the floors. Forrest never really says anything and just listens in. Forrest finds nighttime tough in the army because he misses Jenny and his mother a lot. That night, a guy throws an adult magazine at him to check out. As he turns, he sees Jenny on one of the pages. Soon, Jenny gets kicked out of college for wearing her college sweater during the adult shoot. That little photo shoot lands her a singing gig at a bar. Forrest gets to know about this and arrives there as soon as he can to watch her performance, but he's shocked to see her without clothes in a live adult show theater. She sings her songs with nothing but her guitar covering her as the men in the audience whistle at her. All of the men jeer and want to see Jenny without clothes. Forrest is just stoked that Jenny's dreams have come true because she's singing for an audience. He doesn't know what's happening. One of the men in the front row tries to put money in Jenny's shoe and harasses her. Jenny screams back and Forrest runs to her rescue. He runs right down and pummels him. He tries to take Jenny away but she pushes him away for ruining her show. She tells Forrest she's sick of him always trying to rescue her when she doesn't need rescuing. Forrest apologizes and says he can't help himself because he loves her. Jenny tells him he doesn't know what love is. She asks him about the time they prayed together where she asked God to turn her into a bird. She plans to jump off the bridge they're at. Because of all her problems. Jenny is having suicidal thoughts, but soon, she grabs a ride on the next truck that passes by. She urges Forrest to stay away from her. Before she goes, Forrest tells her that he's being sent off to Vietnam to fight in the war. Jenny is upset to hear this and asks him to promise her that he'll not try to be brave, if there's trouble, but just to turn around and run away. Forrest promises and tells her that he'll write to her all of the time. Jenny doesn't say anything and leaves. Jenny disappears from Forrest's life and he's devastated because of this. His mother consoles him and comforts him before the war. She makes him promise to come back safely to her. He goes to Vietnam with Bubba. They arrive at the camp and see beer and barbecue everywhere. All the soldiers seem to be enjoying themselves. They soon meet their superior, Lieutenant Dan Taylor. Even now, Bubba's attention is on shrimps and nothing else. Dan asks them not to salute him and gives them some advice about staying alive in Vietnam. He tells them that the most important thing to remember is to keep their socks dry all of the time. Infections from wet feet seem to be one of the biggest causes of death while at war. Dan has a long history of his whole family being in the military. He boasts that at least one member of his family has fought and died in every American war and Dan himself is next. He is polite and friendly to Forrest and Bubba and tells them all there is to their battalion. Forrest ends up enjoying Vietnam, because he gets to visit the countryside and take long walks. He doesn't know what's going on but follows all the rules. There's always something to do in Vietnam and Forrest likes it. He doesn't care about bombs exploding and remains calm all the time. At one point, it started raining and didn't stop for 4 months. Because of this, Forrest and Bubba worked in the worst of circumstances. Forrest and Bubba sleep back to back so they don't have to lay their heads in the mud. One night, Bubba asks Forrest to go into the shrimping business with him after the war ends. Forrest readily agrees. He even writes to Jenny, but she never responds. He always thought about her and wanted to meet her more than anything, but she's too busy becoming a hippie and traveling all across the U.S. with other music enthusiasts. One day, Forrest and his platoon find themselves under attack. They're ambushed pretty badly and bombs and bullets rain from everywhere. The platoon starts to get wiped out so they're ordered to run out. Bubba yells at Forrest to run and so he does. He's the fastest runner and pretty soon, he's all alone because the others can't keep up. He turns and doesn't see Bubba anywhere. He starts to get worried and heads back to get Bubba. On his way, Forrest picks up his buddy Tex and carries him away from the trouble. Then, he heads back for Bubba. But every time he goes back, he finds someone else who needs help and brings them to safety point. One of the injured soldiers happens to be Dan, his lieutenant. He refuses to let Forrest help him but Forrest doesn't care. He carries Dan away against his will and gets shot. He screams saying something bit him and falls down but doesn't stop. He gets up again and runs with Dan who's screaming the whole time to be left behind. He rescues all those he can but can't find Bubba. Dan orders him to stay back as the place is very dangerous, but Forrest goes back one last time for Bubba. Just as an airstrike is coming in, he finds Bubba and sees him lathered in blood. He's shaking but tells Forrest he's okay. Forrest is scared to see Bubba and carries him away, as the jungle explodes behind them, with all the missiles coming in. When they get to safety, Bubba asks why all of this has happened. He tells Forrest he wants to go home and eventually dies in Forrest's arms. Forrest is devastated to lose him as Bubba was his best friend. Back in the present day, a new person has joined Forrest on the bus stop bench. He's there to hear all about Forrest's experience who claims he was shot in the butt. Forrest goes to a hospital for treatment and loves that he gets to have all the ice cream he wants because he was shot right in the butt. He finds himself alongside Dan, who has lost both of his legs. Forrest offers him ice cream but Dan is way too overwhelmed with sadness. He's taken away soon. In the hospital, Forrest gets a huge stack of letters from Jenny that never made it to him on the front lines. One day, he's just having ice cream and recovering. When he's asked to play ping pong, Forrest learns how to play it efficiently. For some reason, ping pong comes naturally to him, and he turns into a sort of ping pong prodigy. All the members of his platoon looked at him play and were amazed. One night, Forrest's sleeping when he's viciously pulled out of his bed. It's Dan. He curses Forrest for pulling him away from his destiny, which was to die in the war with honor. He accuses Forrest of cheating him away from his honorable death. But in the end, he comes back to his senses and finds Forrest very innocent. He expresses all his guilt and pain of surviving without legs, but Forrest doesn't say anything. One day, as he's playing ping pong, a messenger comes up to Forrest to inform him that he's been awarded the Medal of Honor. He wants to share the good news with Dan, but the army has already sent him home. 2 weeks later, Forrest leaves Vietnam and comes back to the US. He meets President Johnson and gets his Medal of Honor. His mother is very proud of him. He misinterprets one of Johnson's comments about his injury, and drops his pants in front of everyone to show him the wound in his butt. Everyone in the audience is appalled to see this. One day, as he's touring Washington and clicking pictures, Forrest gets sucked into a group of war protesters and finds himself on stage talking about the war in Vietnam. Just as he's about to talk, an army guy tears all of the wires out of the protest. He goes on speaking but nobody can hear him. By the time the mic is fixed, Forrest finishes his speech and walks away. Just then, he spots Jenny run out of the crowd and into the big pool to get his attention. Forrest runs out to her and hugs her in the pool as everyone around them cheers loudly. They're inseparable again and walk around the protest. She takes him to meet her friends and he soon finds himself at a meeting of the Black Panthers, a pro-black defense. He meets Wesley, Jenny's boyfriend, and Jenny introduced them to each other. The protesters are ready to fight for their brothers in Vietnam. As this is happening, Forrest sees Wesley and Jenny fighting. They bicker for a while until he hits her in the next room. He runs over and punches the guy in the face a bunch of times. After he beats up Wesley, Forrest and Jenny leave. Jenny makes excuses for Wesley saying he doesn't really mean it when he hits her. Forrest tells Jenny he'd like to be her boyfriend instead of Wesley, but she dodges his confession and compliments his army uniform. They're really glad to have met one another. They spend the rest of the night just chatting where he learns that for the past few years, Jenny has been taking substance and living on the streets with her hippie friends. She's soon going to San Francisco with some friends to amplify her music career. Forrest understands but doesn't want her to go. As she's about to leave, Jenny's boyfriend comes to apologize to her but Forrest yells at him in a threatening manner. In the end, Forrest gives her his Medal of Honor to remember him. She doesn't want to keep it, but Forrest just says he got it for doing what Jenny told him to do. Jenny thanks him and says she'll always be his girl forever before leaving once again. Forrest thinks the government will send him back to Vietnam, but instead, they keep him home to play ping pong professionally and to put on shows to inspire the wounded soldiers. He is enrolled in the national team and travels to China to play with their best players. He wins an awful lot and when he gets back home, he realizes he's a sports star. Forrest appears on a talk show where John Lennon happens to be the other guest. He tells everyone about his experience in China and somehow inspires Lennon to write his famous song, but soon, Lennon was shot too. After the interview, Forrest meets Dan, drinking around with really long hair and just living in really poor conditions. Dan is furious that the government gave Forrest the Medal of Honor. He keeps on insulting Forrest, but Forrest can't seem to understand the insults or Dan's sarcastic comments. Dan is about to go away when he slips and falls. Forrest comes to the rescue and drops him at the hotel Dan is staying in. They celebrate the holidays together, watching TV. Dan tells Forrest that he's frustrated with his life, since everyone keeps sending priests to ask him if he's found Jesus yet. Dan tells him he doesn't believe in God or heaven. Forrest tells him he's going to heaven. Dan then asks Forrest to go find some more liquor for him because it's New Year. While they drink in the bar, Forrest says he's going to find some money to buy a shrimping boat because he made a promise to Bubba. He adds that he'll become a shrimp boat captain for Bubba, but Dan sneeringly says that he'll happily be the first mate if Forrest Gump ever becomes a shrimp boat captain. Just then, 2 women come up to Dan and Forrest. Dan flirts with them as the girls talk about their day. Forrest wonders how Jenny is spending her New Year's Eve. The scene pans onto Jenny, who's living in a tiny place with abusive men. She runs away from the place soon. Back in Dan's apartment, Dan is making out with a girl as Forrest zones out. One of the women jumps on Forrest and tries to kiss him, but he's shocked. He panics and knocks her off, but the woman gets offended. She makes fun of him and asks if he's stupid. Dan loses his temper as they make fun of him and he kicks them out. He falls out of his wheelchair as he does so and Forrest runs to pick him up, but he declines. Forrest apologizes for ruining Dan's party. And Dan just wishes him a happy new year. A few months after his meeting with Dan, Forrest's ping pong skills get him an invite to the White House. Forrest meets President Nixon. He and the president chat for a while, and Nixon offers to put Forrest up in a nice hotel, called the Watergate. In the middle of the night, Forrest calls the front desk to complain about some men with flashlights in the room across from him, saying they're disturbing him. The people with the flashlights weren't some ordinary people. But part of a huge scandal that would eventually lead to Richard Nixon's resignation from the presidency. One day, Forrest is playing ping pong when a man walks up to him and says his army service has finished and he's been discharged. His service is over, so Forrest runs back home to his mother. His mother is extremely proud and happy to see him. When he gets home, Forrest finds out that all kinds of companies have been offering money. Forrest isn't sure what to do, but agrees to endorse their ping pong products after his mother tells him that it would be very beneficial to him. The sponsorship gives him the money he needs to go and buy a shrimping boat so that he can keep his promise to Bubba. Forrest doesn't stay home for a long time and decides to visit Bubba's family. They are shocked at his plan and ask him if he's crazy or just plain stupid to take on a shrimping boat with no prior experience. He just replies with his mother's words and visits Bubba's grave to tell Bubba all about the new shrimping boat that he's bought. He talks to his grave and claims that he's figured everything out. He decides to invest all his sponsorship money into the boat. He renovates the shrimping boat and travels through the sea to initiate his business. Even though he'd heard a lot from Bubba, he realizes shrimping is really difficult. He tells his partner that his business is really slow. Forrest doesn't have much luck with shrimping at first. His partner tells him to name his boat for good luck. Forrest has never named a boat before, so he just decides to name it Jenny. He paints Jenny's name on his boat. Meanwhile, Jenny is out in California at high-end parties. She's taking substance at a club with various other people. Forrest never stops thinking about Jenny and internally wishes for her to be happy all the time. He wants her to be safe wherever she is, but Jenny is as reckless as can be. At night, she sits in bed next to a guy taking substance. She doesn't know what she's doing in life. She gets out of bed in a daze and goes to the edge of her apartment's balcony to stand on the railing. She feels the air caressing her face as she stands on the edge. She looks down on the streets below and gulps. It looks like she's going to jump and finally fulfill her dream of becoming. Instead, she backs off at the last second and cries in a chair. She rocks herself back and forth and sobs. Forrest still hasn't had any luck with shrimps. He boats all day long but to no avail. He keeps trying and failing to catch shrimp until one day, he comes into the dock and sees Dan waiting for him. He's so excited to see Dan that he jumps off his boat and swims to him. He greets Dan excitedly and asks Dan what he's doing here. Forrest had sent a letter to Dan long ago to visit him and his business. Turns out, Dan wants to keep his joking promise of coming to be Forrest's first mate, but Dan tells him that he'd never call Forrest sir, and he gladly obliges. In the background, Forrest's drifting boat smashes through the dock, startling them both. They both start their business together and Dan continues to command Forrest on what to do. Dan hangs out at the top of Forrest's mast and directs him towards shrimps. He tells Forrest about his gut feelings on where to find shrimp. Forrest does exactly as told Forrest, but they still don't catch any shrimp. When Forrest asks Dan what he should do next, Dan sarcastically tells him to go to church and pray for it. Forrest does exactly that and even goes to a Baptist church every Sunday to pray for shrimp. He even joins the choir, but they still catch nothing. Dan makes fun of Forrest and taunts his God. Hut just then, the moment Dan asks Forrest where his God is supposed to be, a huge storm blows in and traps them out at sea. Forrest tries his hardest to keep the boat intact and he runs around wherever he can to maintain it. During the storm, Dan hangs out at the top of the boat and screams at God and nature while the rain whips at him. He even laughs and promises them that they'll never sink the boat. He's not scared at all and yells at the top of his lungs as the storm gets stronger and stronger. He laughs like a maniac and mocks God to come to get him. The very next morning, lots of shrimping businesses go down because of the storm. As it turns out, the storm they are trapped in was 1974's Hurricane Carmen, which destroys every boat in the region except Dan and Forrest's boat, which is perfectly intact, the only one out at sea. All of the other boats got smashed against the shore. The news comes out the next morning about his boat being the only one in stable condition, and Forrest's mom is ecstatic that her son is safe and happy. Now that they're the only boat on the water, they catch a ton of shrimp. They collect heaps and heaps of shrimp from the sea and ultimately end up buying a fleet of 12 boats and create the Bubba Gump Shrimp Company. The company takes off and Forrest ends up becoming filthy rich. Forrest is still at the park with the gentleman beside him listening eagerly. The man stops Forrest and laughs at the thought that the naive, chattering man sitting next to him is the owner of the massive Bubba Gump Shrimp Corporation. He thinks it's some sort of a joke and cannot believe that he was sitting next to a millionaire the whole time. The man just laughs and walks away, but another old woman sitting on the bench says that she loved Forrest's story. She exclaims that Forrest can really tell a brilliant story. Forrest asks the woman if she'd like to see a picture of Dan, and then he shows her a picture of himself and Dan on the cover of Fortune magazine. The lady finds out that he was telling her the truth after all and not just some story. One day, Dan stops Forrest in the middle of his shrimping and thanks him for saving his life back in Vietnam. Forrest thinks that at this moment, Dan has finally made his peace with God. He's really happy to see Dan satisfied with himself. As they're having lunch, Forrest gets a phone call that his mother is sick and leaves the shrimping to Dan. He jumps out of the beast without much thought and just runs all of the way back home to see his mother. There's a bunch of people at their house and Forrest asks them about his mother. He eventually finds her dying in bed. She's really happy to see him back. Forrest is really sad to know that his mother won't be with him anymore. But she comforts him by telling him that death is just a part of life. She advises him to not be sad as everyone dies at one point in life. She tells him that she's extremely proud of him and herself for raising Forrest the way she did. She gives him the strength to do well in life and urges him to make his own destiny. She tells him that he'll have to figure out his destiny just like she did. He finds out that his mother has cancer, but it's too late. She dies soon and Forrest buries her on a Tuesday just like she had wanted. At present, the old woman next to Forrest is crying at this sad part in his story. She even misses her bus so she can keep listening to him. She doesn't regret it as tells Forrest that she'll get on the next one. After his mom dies, Forrest is offered a job by his university, and having nothing to go to, he agrees. He takes up a job mowing Greenbow's municipal lawns. In the meantime, Dan successfully runs the shrimping business and keeps sending Forrest his cut of the money. He also gets Forrest to invest in Apple just as the company is starting out. Forrest has no idea that it is the Apple company we all know and love. He agrees to whatever Dan says and invests in it. He continues going to the church and is really happy with where his life is. He makes a lot of money and ends up donating a lot of it. Forrest has learned from his mom that a person only needs so much money on which to live. So he gives a bunch of his money to the church and hospital in Bubba's community. He even hands a check to Bubba's poor family, which basically makes them millionaires overnight. Bubba's family is elated at the news and his mother even faints because of this. Bubba's family lives a life of luxury and have maids to work for them instead. Forrest realizes he's got a lot of money and free time in his hands, so he starts to cut the Greenbow grass for free, but, at nighttime, he always thinks of Jenny and wonders where she is. He would think about her every time his house is silent. He is disappointed to not have her by his side. But one day, as Forrest is cutting the grass on his own lawn, Jenny shows up and walks toward his house. He's stunned to see her. Forrest runs to greet her and she smirks at him. She then jumps and hugs him tightly. They embrace each other for a moment. Jenny stays with Forrest for a while. But she spends almost all of her time sleeping. Forrest just thinks that it's because she's tired. It seems to Forrest as if she hasn't slept in years, but he's glad now that she's happy and safe with whatever she needs right beside her. Forrest and Jenny go for a walk and Forrest goes on and on about everything that he has done so far. He tells her about Dan and his mother passing away. As Jenny is feeling better, they stroll past her old house, which looks old and tattered. It's almost in ruins. Jenny stares at it for a while before continuously throwing rocks at it furiously and collapsing, in tears. Forrest sits beside her and consoles her without saying a word. Jenny decides to stay with Forrest and he couldn't be happier. He doesn't really care about what she had been doing or why she came back. He's just happy that she's with him now. Jenny and Forrest live happily together for a while. They're inseparable once again and spend every passing second with each other. He brings her flowers every day. And she gives him a pair of sneakers to keep his feet comfortable and running. He and Jenny are like a family and she even shows him how to dance. Forrest thinks of it as the happiest time in his life. They sit by the lake and watch the fireworks burst up in the sky. They come home late at night and Jenny kisses him goodnight before going to bed. Forrest just stares at her while drinking Dr. Pepper. As Jenny is going up the stairs, Forrest runs up to her and asks her if she'll marry him. Jenny is shocked to hear him ask that. He tells her that he'll be a very good husband. Jenny agrees but continues saying that he wouldn't want to marry a woman like her. Forrest doesn't care about it and asks her why she doesn't love him like he does. Forrest tells her that he might not be a smart man, but he knows what love is. He goes out of the house, hurt and upset. Jenny doesn't say anything and goes to her room. Late one night, Forrest is staring at the ceiling in his bed when Jenny sneaks into Forrest's bed. She gets on his bed just like in old times and tells him she loves him. They kiss and continue making out for a while. They have romantic moments and spend the night together. But the very next day, Jenny sneaks out and gets into a taxi. The taxi driver asks her where she's running off to, but she simply replies that she's not running anymore. She leaves Forrest alone once again as he's fast asleep. Forrest realizes this when he wakes up and she's nowhere to be found, but before she goes, she leaves behind Forrest's Medal of Honor. He continues to stare at her room and remember her. He's all alone and numb with nothing to do in life. He wears the shoes she gave him all the time and stares out into the distance. All Forrest can do afterward is listen to the silence of his big house. With Jenny gone, Forrest doesn't have control over himself. He decides to go for a little run. He starts running and doesn't stop. He runs and runs until he's out of his town and then his county, and then across Alabama, and all the way to the Pacific Ocean. He just keeps on going and never stops. Then, he turns and runs back the other way until he hits the Atlantic. He never gets the urge to stop. If he ever gets tired, he just sleeps and eats. The old woman beside him is utterly fascinated by his story and listens eagerly. He runs across fields and mountains and bridges. He runs alone and in groups until he reaches the countryside. During all this, he never forgets his mother or Bubba, or even Jenny. He thinks about Jenny every day even after she left him all alone. Eventually, people hear about what he's doing. He's famous and is shown all over the local news. People start to get inspired by him. Everyone that knows him learns about his running journey. Even Jenny, who's a waitress now, hears about him on the news. But, they want to know why Forrest is running. The media swarms him whenever they can and asks him lots of questions. He just replies that he feels like it. Nobody really believes him as they think it's insane to run for a continuous 2 years just for fun. People even start joining Forrest now that he's known all love. People have become his fan and join him in his running. All of them seem to think he's got his life figured out and that he's a very happy man. Even large groups join him on his runs and keep asking him for advice as if he's some sort of life coach. But somehow, Forrest ends up inadvertently giving out some great ideas. He unironically keeps on changing people's fates for the better wherever he goes, without even realizing it. Forrest always has a horde of people running along with him. Finally, after 3 years, 2 months, 14 days, and 16 hours, Forrest stops running, for no particular reason. Everyone thinks he's going to do something inspirational, but he just claims to be tired. He thinks that he's finally let go of his past and that it's time to move on. He's feeling tired, and he decides to head home. He eventually returns to Alabama. While footage of the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan plays in the background, Forrest gets a letter from Jenny asking him to come to Savannah. Forrest is excited and that's why he's here sitting on the bench just waiting for her. He was asked to visit her on Henry Street. She tells him that she's thought about him after seeing him running on TV. The woman next to Forrest recognizes the address and tells him that the place is really close by. Forrest asks her for directions, grabs his stuff, and bids her goodbye. He starts running again as the woman wishes him all the best. He finally reaches her apartment and she hugs him tightly. He appreciates her living arrangements and is just happy to see her again. She shows him the scrapbook she's made that contains all of his achievements and articles were written about him. Jenny apologizes to Forrest for taking him for granted and saying that she was in a very rough place. Just then, a woman comes by and drops off a young boy. Forrest just stares at the little boy. She introduces Forrest to him and tells him that the little boy's name is Forrest as well. Forrest is elated to know that and soon Jenny tells him that Forrest is that boy's father. Forrest is emotional to know this and doesn't know how to take it in. Jenny assures him that it's okay and Forrest hadn't done anything wrong. Forrest says that the boy is the most beautiful thing he's ever seen, but he's also worried. Worried that little Forrest is also slow like him, but Jenny assures him that little Forrest is actually really smart and at the top of his class. Jenny must have gotten pregnant after she and Forrest slept together in his house 3 years ago. Forrest goes into the next room and sits next to the boy. Together, they watch Sesame Street and chat with each other. At the park one day, Jenny tells Forrest that she's sick with some kind of virus that the doctors don't understand and can't fix. Forrest thinks it's just some cough and cold but turns out, it's very serious. Forrest asks her and little Forrest to come to stay with him. He says he'll take care of Jenny, and Jenny asks him to marry her back in Greenbow, Alabama. Forrest readily agrees to the request. At the wedding, he sees Dan come up to him with metal legs. Forrest is shocked to see him there. Dan congratulates him and introduces him to his fiancée, Susan. It looks like things have worked out really well for Dan as well. Forrest and Jenny get married and live happily as a family with little Forrest. One day, Forrest brings breakfast in bed to Jenny, who looks like she's getting worse. She asks Forrest if he was scared in Vietnam. He just tells her that sometimes it was nice when the stars came out and he found strength in them. Then, he thinks of all of the times he looked at the sky and the stars. He tells her everything and how he's always inspired by the early morning sunrise. She says she would have loved to be there with him, to which he replies that she was. He tells her how he never stopped thinking about her. She tells him that she loves him a lot and dies on a Saturday morning. Forrest stands at her grave, finishing his story. He tells her that he has her old house bulldozed because she hated it so much. He continues to tell her that death is a part of life and to not worry about little Forrest. He tells her their son is doing just fine and that he's taking good care of him. Forrest does all the duties of a father wonderfully and spends all of his time with his son. He cries and tells Jenny that little Forrest is just so smart. He's really proud of his son. Forrest Jr. has written a letter for his mom, but he doesn't want his dad to read it. Forrest understands it and just leaves the letter at Jenny's grave. Forrest says he's not sure if each person has a destiny or if they're just floating around randomly. But he's hoping it's both happening at the same time. He cries and tells Jenny that he misses her a lot. He finally walks away and back to his house. Forrest waits for the bus with his son and sees that he's reading the same book that his mother used to read him. Before his son boards the bus, Forrest tells his son he loves him, and his son says he loves him too. On the steps of the bus, little Forrest introduces himself to the bus driver just like Forrest Sr. did years ago. The bus drives away, leaving Forrest by himself. He sits on the side of the road as a little white feather blows up into the wind and flies away.